by asking you about 5G, which is obviously the most kind of potentially disruptive in a positive way, right? Development in the industry right now, not just for Telus, but industry-wide. So if we can start from the industry perspective, how significant are the financing needs going to be to acquire that spectrum?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me.
Sorry, I kind of skipped over that.
No,
Welcome.
Thank you. If you step back, 5G is a natural evolution of wireless. It is going to enable much, much higher speeds and much lower latency. So it's going to allow a lot more throughput through the wireless network, and it's going to allow us to implement services that weren't previously possible because of the latency effects, so the amount of time it takes back and forth. I heard the previous speaker speaking about connected cars as being one example of that might leverage 5G. In terms of the how significant it is for the industry, I would say it's a big step. It's a very important step, but it's not transformational in that for many generations now, the wireless network has been getting faster and better latency. What's happened is as we've moved from the original wireless networks that were really for voice to wireless networks that were for data to wireless networks that can support video and the sorts of things we're doing today, you've had to build wireless networks that are denser and that use more spectrum, different portions of spectrum.
But the spectrum costs money, so there's going to be a significant cost outlay in order to compete, in order to acquire that spectrum. So sort of taking it back to the fixed income side, what is that going to mean for financing? Again, from an industry perspective, but also from your point of view.
Well, again, the spectrum costs money, but it's only part of the investment in 5G. You have spectrum, and that creates your wireless piece. And then you have the backhaul. And that's actually where most of the investment is required into the backhaul. So yes, there will be auctions of millimeter wave spectrum and 3.5 spectrum, and in Canada, 600 megahertz spectrum that will require investments by the telcos. And this millimeter wave and 3.5 in the US as well will require investments. But it will just as much require a denser, more fiber rich network at the street level. So the distance between the cell sites is much, much smaller. There are micro or small cell architectures today, and or they will be. And the bandwidth that you need coming back from the cell sites is orders of magnitude larger in a 5G network than it is today. So one of the things that Telus has been doing, even though 5G won't be in Canada probably for 2 or 3 years in any meaningful way, we are building out our fiber networks we're building out a fiber to the home network. But in building that fiber to the home network, we're building a wireless backhaul network that will touch lampposts and sides of buildings that will eventually or today hold our small cell architecture. So for telcos that are making that investment today, they're kind of pre-investing, if you like, for 5G. If there are telcos that aren't making that investment, then they have a much bigger debt requirement come 2020, 2021.
So you're doing it now. What does that mean for your capital spending plans and your financing plans?
For Telus, it's kind of sort of more of the same. So we're about 55% of the way through our fiber to the home program. And I expect that will continue at roughly the same sort of capital intensity that we've had over the last few years, maybe tailing off a little bit as we get into the back half of it. And there will be some spectrum investments that we will make that are factored into our long-term plans. How much it actually is will depend on what happens at the auction. And in the case of 3.5 and millimeter wave auctions, it'll depend on the rules associated with those auctions.
Is there a ballpark figure? Is there a range you can give us?
We haven't said publicly any range. So I can say that I think the reserve price on the 600 megahertz spectrum is $1.5 billion for the industry. I expect it'll go higher than reserve.
Another industry-wide question, but one of the things that's been happening in Canada is that the CRTC continues to give more access to companies that make infrastructure investments rather than the resellers who are kind of piggybacking on the back of that infrastructure. What are the ramifications of that?
I think that's one of the things that's made the Canadian telecom industry such a special place to invest. Because we have a regulatory environment that supports the sort of facilities-based competition, the telecoms, by and large, have had the confidence to make the long-term investments in fiber, in spectrum. I mean, these are 10, 20, 40, 50-year investments. In a stable regulatory environment, you're prepared to make those investments. You make those investments, you end up with the world-class telecom infrastructure that we have in Canada. And I'm not just speaking about Telus, I'm speaking about the entire industry. The data speeds and the robustness of our wireless network is basically second to very few places, anyways, in the world. It's more robust than the U.S. networks, and within Canada, Telus is very proud, to have the fastest network in Canada. And what do we get from that, and how does that go back to the? Well, what we get from that is better customer service. When we have better customer service and we have more capability, we have happier consumers. We have happier consumers. We have they don't attract the attention of politicians because there isn't a problem to fix. We don't have a problem to fix. We don't have interventionist regulations. We don't have interventionist regulations. Then we have a stable environment in which to make the long-term investments that build the robust telecom network. So it's a virtuous circle.
You need your customers, though, to be willing to pay, essentially, for that advantage, for the customer service, for all of that. And there are all of these new players constantly coming into the market. Now, my understanding is that to date, the sort of loss of market share that some had predicted has really been mitigated by growth in the market. Is there a point at which there's a tipping point and you see that becoming more of a threat? Like how long can it continue to mitigate?
Are you talking about loss of market share, I guess, by the larger share competitors? Because and I'm thinking in a wireless space,
right,
in particular, where there were new entrants came in after the 2008
exactly.
Auctions. Well, there is a lot of runway for the Canadian market in terms of penetration. We're at about 86, 87%. The U.S. market is well over 100, 105, 110% penetration. And Canada, for years and years, has lagged the U.S., but on the same trajectory. So I'm not saying the Canadian penetration is necessarily going to get to 110%, but it's got a long way to go. And we've seen growth in subscriber acquisitions across the industry, up 40%, I think, year to date, year over year. So there is room for growth from that perspective, and that's just penetration into the market. We're also seeing the market itself growing as we have immigration into Canada and a government that promotes immigration into Canada, and then part of what's driving the penetration is, of course, more devices per individual. You're giving your 12-year-old now a cell phone or an iPhone as opposed to just your 16-year-old or your college kid, and your grandparents have them instead of just your parents, as it was maybe 20 years ago.
Do you guys have a forecast, a date in the future when you think that penetration kind of peaks or becomes stagnant?
It's actually a long way out. We've been sort of growing penetration in the sort of 3-4% per year, if you go back on average over the last number of years. So it's quite a few years before we're at the U.S. levels.
I thought it was interesting that you and BCE and Rogers all sold 30-year bonds in U.S. dollars this year. Why?
Well, a couple of reasons. So why 30 years
and why
independent
dollars,
of U.S. dollars? The U.S. dollars is a little bit easier to answer. The rates were good. So it was rate arbitrage for the most part. By accessing the U.S. Market, we get a much richer pool of, or deeper pool, I guess, of investors. But with the way the rates were, there was rate arbitrage. Now, why 30 years? 30 years makes tremendous sense because we're making 30-year plus investments in assets. The fiber that we're building will be there for 50 years. The spectrum licenses are 20-year licenses. So matching long-term liabilities with long-term assets is a very prudent thing to do. And it also, sort of elongates our maturity profile of our debt. And so for Telus in particular, we have nothing coming due in 2019, and $1 billion pretty stable $1 billion a year for the next number of years. It's pretty predictable.
Was the reception pretty good for that issuance?
Reception was phenomenal. We got well oversubscribed. The U.S. investors, I think, welcomed another name in telecom space. They understand the industry, but maybe fill up on AT&T and Verizon, and an opportunity for some diversification into some strong Canadian names, and Telus in particular.
You've kind of hinted at the answer to this one, but would you re-enter that market then, and if so, with a different maturity?
We would look across the curve, and for sure we would re-enter that market, as long as the rates are, make sense, make favorable, and we do appreciate that. Once it's not just helpful to dip a toe into the U.S. market, that once we're in, we should be in longer term, and that makes it a bit better for the investors. They have, they can create a curve across our various maturities, and so we're looking forward to being in the U.S. in the future for sure.
Any idea when you would issue in Canadian dollars next?
Yeah, as I said, we don't have any maturities in 2019, but there is a spectrum auction. So we could issue in 2019. It sort of will depend, and whether it's Canadian dollars or U.S. dollars will depend on the environment at the time. And
what are your expectations for rates in Canada then? Because obviously that's going to feed into that.
Yeah, you're asking. I'm a taker of rates, in a sense. Lower for longer was what I would hope, but we do recognize that we think that rates will move up slowly, but not substantially.
Any interest in funding in other currencies besides the Canadian dollar or the U.S. dollar?
I think the arbitrage would have to be really, really strong. We make a commitment. When we made the commitment to come into the U.S., we knew we had to support it. Our needs aren't that big that we couldn't support ourselves in Canada. The U.S. is extra. We don't need to go anywhere else unless the arbitrage was phenomenal.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.